So many people say that non-duality is nonsense. And today I'm here to tell you that I completely agree. It is a complete nonsense. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove it to you. And also, I'm going to show you how it can make you free or how it can free you. My passion in non-duality is not from reading texts and listening to videos and studying non-duality as a theory or as a concept. It's from diving deep into the world of self-identities with my clients and with myself. I've spent thousands of hours in deep investigation or inquiry, where we look into all the games the self-identity is just the games that likes to play, the way it likes to control everybody, including itself. And this whole show is just happening in the head, the way it needs to protect itself, that its main function, because all the self-identities, all the roles that we play or identify with, whether it's the victim, the high achiever, the entertainer, it can be the perpetrator, or the smaller roles, the caretaker, the perfectionist, whatever, all of these self-identities, they come under the big umbrella, which is just the self. And the nature of the self is separate from the world. Therefore, it is a duality. It is the self and the other. And so its main function is to protect itself. And so because I've been diving so deeply into all the games and strategies and the purpose and all the games that it's playing, it's also obvious that the identity lives in a story, in a storyland that it mistakes for reality. And for the identity, everything needs to make sense. So everything it does, it has to have a purpose, intention. So, because it also is aware of its final expiration, it lives in completely imagined timeline with the past and future, and it has to do something to protect itself and to achieve some final place of security that is permanent. And of course, that can never be achieved. But it's striving to do that. So everything it does, it always has to have this purpose, and it's tied to that purpose of achieving that imaginary goal. And so everything for the identity has to make sense. Everything is within the reason. And that's why reality or non-duality really doesn't make sense, is when you jump out of that story. Because in that story, you can spend years in self-development and try to improve yourself, try to make yourself more confident, more calm, manage your emotions, your anger, do some healing on your, all kinds of stuff. But all of this is just within that story of yours, and it inevitably oscillates within that story between, suddenly I feel more confident, like, oh, I made it. And it oscillates with, I'm not good enough. Like, it's always that within that duality, because it's the nature of the self. It's just not real, but it only has to be discovered. It's when I talk about it, it doesn't make much sense. So today, doesn't make much sense, like non-duality itself. So today I'm going to give you a real example. I'm going to give you like a really simple example from a regular life. It's about boundaries and relationships. I think a lot of people can relate. So we're not going to go into some big spiritual topics like life and death, but just like really something simple, which comes from my recent conversation and work with one of my clients. And it was just such a great example. And I will show you how impossible it is for that identity to jump out of that story, because it just needs to make sense of everything. And how non-duality really doesn't make any sense, even on the personal level, even when we look into the daily challenges that we face. And so I'll give you this little story, a little background into this situation. It's So my client, his name is Tom. He's working in sales in a medical research company, and he's really good and successful in what he's doing. He's a great salesman. However, he's got a colleague. She doesn't work in the same department as he does, but each other work affects each other because essentially they have one client. They have the same client within that company. And so my client is doing great, and he just was complaining that this colleague of his, Catherine, she sometimes, even though she's doing a great job in other areas, sometimes she doesn't finish her work. And so then he has no choice but to finish it for her, maybe writing emails and stuff like that for those particular clients. And so he feels frustrated because he really sees there is no other choice. Like, she can't do it. She's been trying, but she just has a different kind of way of working. And the only way how he imagines it to be done is by him finishing it eventually. And so he's trying to come up with a solution. He's trying to do everything what he can. He's trying to ignore it, and then the work doesn't get done and it affects him. So he feels bad and guilty. So that doesn't work. He tries to he thinks about maybe, if she left the department, that would be better. But there is other people who believe that she's really good in other areas. So that also doesn't work. And so the easiest thing for him, the less evil for him, which really makes sense, is to actually sometimes on occasion do the work for her. If she doesn't finish what is her responsibility, he just jumps in and do it for her. And so it's been happening like that. And, the frustration, the resentment is like piling up underneath. And so let's look into the self-identity here, what it could be. Maybe you have found yourself sometime in a situation where you feel stuck, when you feel like you have to do something. If it doesn't get done, nobody else will do it. It's maybe about boundaries. You've been probably on the self-development journey for a while. So you've been already exploring boundaries, and you may know that sometimes it's so easy to have good boundaries, and in those times when it really matters, it's actually really hard sometimes. And for some unforeseen reason, we abandon ourselves just when it's the least convenient. We sabotage ourselves. And so this is exactly what's been happening. And so it's been taking toll on Thomas because he's been thinking about it. It took a lot of peace of his mind. If it continues like that, he has to deal with it. He has to micromanage, try to chase her, have conversations with her. It's a lot to take on, while she just doesn't believe that it's necessary to create all of these emails in that timeline. And so for him, the self-identity in this case is the enabler. It is somebody who, maybe you've heard that word, enabling somebody. We blame them. We look at them as it's their fault, but we are not aware that actually we also play a role. If there is any kind of situation, any kind of relationship, it takes always two people to create that dynamic, but it takes one to change that. And so that's why we look into the self-identity, because it's always behind. If there is any kind of tension, conflict, or uncomfortable or painful emotion, there's always behind it the self-identity, no matter what. There is no stressful situation in the world that would not involve the self-identity. It's really the only problem, if there ever was one, because essentially it's not even real. So let's look into this enabler. And if you are maybe in a relationship, you may find this familiar sometimes. If you feel that sometimes it's maybe not doing their job and you have to kind of chase them. So the enabler is somebody who unintentionally rewards somebody else for the lack of responsibility. So because they keep rewarding them, that dynamic stays put. And so my client, Tom, is rewarding her by actually doing her job, like over and over, even if it's a small thing, like he is unintentionally rewarding her. So he's keeping this dynamic going. And as I said before, it makes sense for him to keep doing this because he doesn't see any way out. He sees that, okay, he spends 5 minutes every week or so, which is not a big deal. It just makes sense. It's the least evil, so I'm gonna do it. And this is exactly how the self-identity works. It figures everything out in its head, and it just comes up with a solution that is completely disconnected from reality and unintentionally, well, actually the identity has that purpose. Its purpose is to stay in that dynamic. It has no intention to leave that dynamic and to actually enter freedom, love, or compassion. It has no intention of that. Its only intention is to keep itself in the dynamic where it can feel separated and where it can play the game of superior, inferior. In this case, Tom is feeling superior, a little bit, above her because he feels more competent, he feels more responsible. So he's keeping his identity while blaming her that she's not doing what she's supposed to win while he's feeling stuck. And so, the solution is not about trying to figure it out, not trying to talk to her from that space of the self-identity, because the self-identity is always like 10 steps ahead of you. It doesn't matter what you do, like it's a setup. You will always set yourself up for, even if something seems to work for a while, you will always set yourself up for eventual, I wanted to say failure. It's not really failure. It's just that stuckness. You will always end up doing what you don't really want to do, which means loss of freedom, loss of peace of mind, because you will have to think about it and it will take a big portion of your mental space, and loss of love and compassion, because you cannot judge the other person and at the same time have compassion for them. So, in other words, you feel completely disconnected from your true nature. And that is the whole intention for the identity. And so how to jump out of the story, it's by dissolving this identity. And the way we do it in my sessions with my clients is we really look into the purpose of that identity, what it's trying to really achieve, how it's trying to keep itself safe. And also I help my client to discover that it's just not working. It's never been working. So in a way, it's just we sabotage the whole plan of that self-identity it has underneath, and it just dissolves. It just stops having any power once you see that what it's trying to do so much, it's just not working. And so for that, you really have to jump out of the story. You have to get into, non-duality, reality, which means that, without that identity, everything is suddenly completely different. You look at it from it's not even a perspective, because now you don't take any sides. There is nothing to protect. And also, by the way, this work is very emotional, because there have been anything that's involving the self-identities, there's always emotions. There's always some suppressed emotions from the past. All the identity comes from past stories. They originate in some sort of, when we suppressed our emotions, when we didn't feel safe to really express ourselves, and it's projected into the future. And so we are not only collapsing the self, to realizing it's not real in the moment, we're collapsing the whole story. And without the whole story, suddenly you look at the situation and there is freedom. And it almost like it makes no sense what you've been doing before. And it becomes very clear what your next steps are. It becomes very effortless. There is no effort needed. The effort trying to do something is the domain 100% of the identity. Without the identity, it just becomes so clear what to do. And in this case, it was just effortless to, set the boundaries, make the agreements. And there was no emotion of guilt or stress associated with it. Because before, there would be so much guilt around it. You don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, or you think it's maybe too much, you being too strict, or whatever story that is connected to the identity. Without those stories, it's just so effortless to be what you are, to do what you need to do what you want to do. And people respond perfectly in that space. They give you the perfect feedback, and it's just an effortless moment to moment progression in that situation. And so it doesn't make sense if I told him, okay, like when he's still in that identity, and if I told Tom, like, okay, well, you have to stop that. You have to, set high standards, and you have to make sure that you will never do any work for her. This wouldn't work for him, because he's still coming from that identity. He's trying to protect his own identity. He's actually invested in staying the enabler. He is receiving some benefits, but it costs him also a lot of, the peace of mind, the connection, the freedom, like everything, basically the disconnection from the true self. And so, non-duality doesn't make sense in any way. And this was just a brief example, or a simple example, where you may have similar situation also in your life, where you feel stuck, resigned, and you go crazy in your head. Meaning you think about it, you're rehearsing things in your head, you're planning, you're overthinking. That's because you try to find a solution that makes sense. But somehow it will just never work. It will just never give you that freedom, that peace of mind, and that connection that you're looking for. That's just not the domain of what the identity does. So I hope it made a little bit sense that non-duality doesn't make sense. It's jumping out of the story of the separation into what is, which is storyless, which is beyond reason, which is beyond making sense. And it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't need to be reasonable. It's just the way it is. And as I like to say, it's magic. It's unexplainable. It doesn't come from anywhere. It's not going anywhere. It's just what is. What if all of your anxious thoughts were just one big excuse to play it safe? Stop hiding. Step out of mediocrity and stagnation and discover authentic momentum.